All right, guys, welcome back from spring break. I hope everybody had a great one, got to travel. Heard some of y'all were able to go to Mexico, which is very cool. Um, I stayed home and went through a cookbook and did a ton of Chinese cooking, so that was a very fun time. All right, so last week we went over public opinion and does it matter? One of the most important things about public opinion, and I think we all instinctually know this on some level, is causal sensitivity, or what's the context the crisis exists within. And there's rally around the flag, which normally is an increase of public opinion. So famous cases of that: Pearl Harbor, September 11th, the USS Maine. There's elite cues, which are elites suggesting how the conversation will be discussed. And the two-level game in selling, or politicians using public opinion domestically as a way to affect public opinion, or not public opinion, but deal making internationally. We had the wider discussion on does it matter. Um, with wars, generally public opinion is super high at the beginning and then drops off as the war goes on, especially if the goals are not clearly defined. But we have this pre-internet media that we're going over today. So that's agenda setting, framing effects, 24-hour news and rapid response, investigative journalism, and gatekeeping. There is a British TV show that I really enjoy. I can't say the name because it's inappropriate. But in one of the episodes, a more optimistic character is watching the news and she says, you know, well, it's so messed up that the news only focuses on the negative things. They're watching news about a bus crash. She says, the news will report on a bus crash, but what about all the buses that made it safely today? Why aren't they in the news? To which one of the other characters says, yeah, I guess the news should just be a dispassionate list of all the events that happened every day, and it would take forever. The joke being is that news tends to be about stuff that goes wrong because people don't really care when stuff goes right. Uh, but another thing the news acts as is basically a filter, which is what we see with this. And there's all the events that happen in the world, and media elites throughout the news will filter it out to find out what is the most interesting, what's the most reportable. If any of y'all have any exposure to media or journalism studies, you probably heard the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads, which is if the news is bad, it's normally going on the front page. But what we're going to talk about is this filtration process, or how public opinion and everything affects what the news decides to show us and what it decides to leave out. Now, of course, the big first newsman in American history, Benjamin Franklin. He owned a bunch of printing presses in Philadelphia, helped bring movement, energy toward the revolution. And if you went to the events that there was extra credit for, that I believe I saw 2 or 3 of y'all at, you'll know that one of his proteges within this, who published with Ben Franklin, was your boy Thomas Paine. Not really a newspaper, but he published an opinion piece called Common Sense with Ben Franklin's support. Now, news of the USS Maine blowing up in Cuba is a big part of what got a bunch of people to sign up for the Spanish-American War, as I just talked about. Now, with the destruction of the Maine, it's still not totally sure that it was the work of any enemy, and it might have been an accident, and it might have been intentional from the U.S. government to kick up the war, but it was reported as fact that it was the attack of an enemy. And this is, of course, the age of like yellow journalism. So very pulpy, attention-grabbing headlines that newsmen, like the guy on the right here, William Randolph Hearst, would abuse. And of course, William Randolph Hearst was the inspiration for what's often considered to be the best movie of all time. Orson Welles is his movie Citizen Kane. We talked about how just news of the Pearl Harbor attacks is what kicked off a lot of U.S. support for World War II. People signing up for the military before FDR really even responded, or immediately after hearing about his response. And of course, there's also the big uptick in military recruitment after the September 11th attacks. Now, a lot of this is politicians responding to news, but where it gets to be quite interesting is when the news starts filtering politicians, or let's say like the tail wagging the dog. When my dad ran for county commission at Loudoun County, so very, very, very localized government office. He's not pictured here because he ended up not running, and we'll go over why. One of the first questions he got from voters and local newspapers was, "What is your stance on illegal immigration?" Now, Loudoun County Commission is important, but it doesn't have any real big stance one way or another on immigration. And so after seeing how kind of ridiculous a question like that was, he decided not to run. Point being, though, is even in local office, the news can trick you into having an opinion that you might not care about as a way to filter you or filter your opinions to a wider group of people. Now, almost important as the Loudoun County Commission is the mayor of New York City. And we saw something similar during the New York City mayoral debate either earlier this year or last year. But the candidates were asked where the first country they would visit, what that would be as mayor of New York. And the eventual winner, Zohran Mamdani, said he doesn't really care where to visit. He wants to focus on New York, which was, he was the only person to say that, and he ended up winning partially because that made him such an outlier. There are other reasons too, of course. Point being, though, is the news asking him this, or asking all the candidates this, does put them on the record for something that's not terribly relevant to their jobs. Another way the media is manipulated by the government is distraction. So in March of 1999, going on for, I believe, till the end of the summer, the Clinton administration was doing airstrikes in Yugoslavia. And that sort of ate up all the oxygen for the media environment and everything. And they were really just talking about that. Now, this was in March. In February, so a month earlier, all the media conversation was about Clinton's involvement in a sex scandal with Monica Lewinsky. With the distraction of the bombing of Yugoslavia, the focus shifted and people quit talking about Monica Lewinsky for a very long time. Now, this is pre-internet or pre the environment we see today, internet. The internet in 1999 was not like it is today. But we even see this post-internet, not history really repeating itself, but history rhyming to a certain extent. What that's called is agenda setting, or this idea that the news is going to influence what a politician cares about by bringing these issues in at, sort of from the left field or almost at random. Um, when people ask you what's your opinion on something, it's, I think, generally an instinct for most people to give their opinion, even if it's not a very strong one. But then when the media does that to a politician, they make it part of the agenda. So Loudoun County Commission, I would assume most of the people on Loudoun County Commission are public with their opinions on immigration, despite them not having much to say on federal immigration policy. The other one is framing effects, or how does the media frame certain events? A famous case of this is this picture here. This isn't the real video. It's from the movie based off it from like the mid 2000s, but Frost Nixon. After his presidency, Nixon gave interviews to this journalist named Frost and was expecting a softball, but Frost actually pressed him on the bombing of Cambodia, especially. When you look at the Wikipedia page, it talks about it being a covert bombing campaign, which is apparently a thing. But yeah, the U.S. had bombed Cambodia under Nixon as part of the Vietnam War, but Cambodia is a different country, so there were these concerns that it was violating another country's territorial integrity. Cambodia wasn't really that much of a villain or a rival to the United States. The U.S. would go on to work with more Cambodian elements to fight communism. So there were all these issues there. But when people saw the Frost Nixon interview and Frost pressing him on Cambodia, a lot of the response was this: holy crap, we were bombing Cambodia. People didn't know until these framing effects and this agenda setting. Because it's pre-internet, there's not much reporting about it. Cambodia didn't make that filter we talked about earlier. Now, framing effects is something the media does, especially now. But it's this sort of generally an either or decision from the media. And we'll go into examples of that. Now, if you want to, you can pause the video or read what the actual Bush Doctrine is. But basically, there's no distinction between terrorists and countries where terrorists are harbored. This was not accurately represented in the media, and I think most people, even my age, who were more around for this, would even tell you that the Bush Doctrine was something else. It was this idea that you're either with us or against us. Ignoring all the fine print there, that's what a lot of people still think the Bush Doctrine is now. A no neutral states policy, where what it really was states and terrorist groups, well, terrorist groups in the states that harbor them are equally guilty. Another big case was comparing the US war in Vietnam along with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And you see how those are even said differently because within the lexicon or within how we talk about these things, we still use different languages that are a bit biased. We wouldn't say the US invasion of Vietnam or the Afghan war. And I do this without thinking just because I've grown up in this environment when they're ultimately very similar. During the Vietnam War, the two terms people threw around were hawks and doves. You can probably guess which supports which. Um, but it was either or. You're in one of two camps. You're either a hawk or a dove, is a lot of what the media pushed. When in reality, there's way more than two options. Academics being academics and always liking to complicate things, where one group that tried to add to this conversation with the owls, or you almost think of it as a Redditor now who's just sort of focused on saying, well, actually, but as an academic, I have to make the owl look cool in this photo. So here you go. And why we're talking about rally around the flags with this either or thing is because people's passions get really, really high, and they normally don't have the instinct to think about the different options to respond to a crisis. So September 11th, it was a lot of people's first gut feeling was, okay, whose ass do we have to kick? Because everyone's very angry about this, and it didn't really occur to a lot of people that a 20-year war in the Middle East wasn't the only option, or between just taking the attacks on the chin and pretending they didn't happen versus a 20-year war in the Middle East, that there were other options. Um, After the attacks during the Munich Olympics, for example, Mossad did a bunch of assassinations against the people who organized it through Mossad, not an Israeli or Israeli allied invasion of other places. And that affected domestic policy too. Um, all of a sudden, we talked about this whole security state rise. The government needs to be able to spy on everybody to figure out who the terrorists are. So this sort of false either or choice given was you give up all your privacy or you let the terrorists win. Where in reality, there's a lot more gray area. Now, I recognize when I say that I sound like a Redditor slash owl, but I am what I am. But this whole safety versus having privacy or having to choose between privacy or safety really dominated, especially the 2010s. And speaking of the media thinking you have less choices than you do have, one very egregious case of this was NBC during the 2020 Democrat primary debates. There were, as you can see, a lot of candidates, but what was interesting is there were two candidates who were there were three candidates that were very anti-institutional. One being Bernie Sanders, who was always going to get a lot of coverage because he has a lot of popular support. Two candidates, though, that really stood out as almost third parties running as Democrats, other than Bernie Sanders, who literally is third party most of the time, were Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Young. Now, what's interesting is that they were given such little time to talk at the debate that NBC spent more time apologizing for their lack of ability to talk during the debate than they actually talked during the debate, which is very interesting. The point being is that the media will just write off candidates they feel like are irrelevant or not important. Now, you might be thinking, well, what the media decides to focus on is very intentional, where that's not always the case, especially going back to Walter Cronkite in this early area of broadcast news. There was only I believe, 2 or 3 hour time slot, which was all that CBS would give to the news. So everybody would watch this program, absorb the same information, and then form their opinions based off that. And I'd never watched any Walter Cronkite reporting myself. I don't know why I would, but I do know he has a reputation for being very fair, very honest with his reporting. But then the 90s happened. So Cronkite retires from CBS Evening News in 1981, and there's a bit of a adjustment period to figuring out what the future of broadcast news is. And by the 90s, there's an answer to that. And that answer is called the 24-hour news cycle. Now, imagine you're in the 90s. You have a very boxy suit. Friends is your favorite TV show. You have one of these gigantic cell phones. The one on the right is Danny Glover, an actor in a movie called Lethal Weapon. And him carrying around this briefcase phone was presented at the time as like the coolest thing of all time. He can have a phone that's, he can just carry around with him. That's insane. But with this increase in different TV channels and stuff like that, you're not always going to make the same news program. So we have this sort of introduction of what's called news channels that play the news 24/7. And that's really pioneered by this fella here, Ted Turner, who sort of made CNN the household name it is. And not to say that, well, another thing is that this news is going to be more biased at the time too. So it's the 90s. CNN is generally very positive towards the Clinton administration. So it gets the nickname Clinton News Network instead of Cable News Network, which is what it actually stands for. And alongside CBS, you have, like we talked about, the introduction of CNN, MSNBC, which came from Microsoft, actually, a merger between, or a cooperation between Microsoft and NBC, and Fox News. Now, with diversifying newsrooms and the really kicking off in the 80s, but going more so even then, you have the age of the big hair newscaster, or even the guys here look like they're using hairspray. So the big hair actually does mean something too. It's meant to be flashy, presentable, and all this. So we have these effects of the 24-hour news cycle. Think about this in terms of supply and demand. You have a huge demand for news to fill up these 24 hours. And there's not terribly more supply. So what it does is it starts sensationalizing stuff that really isn't as newsworthy as people would think. It's fierce competition between all these channels is what's driving this up, or what we'd say is actually driving it down because standards are lowering. And then there's this increase in demand we talked about. They have a whole 24 hours to fill. There's no break, leading to an overall decrease in quality. And then that's where a lot of the negative news stereotypes definitely start to pop up. I remember in that South Park episode, there's part of it where they talk about intentionally going out and instead of preparing for the news day, what you're supposed to do is make sure your hair looks as fabulous as possible. Also on that news radio picture at the bottom left, Joe Rogan in the brown shirt there just does not look like he wants to be there. And there's also this introduction of live news, or watching events as they go on. Sort of what made the OJ trials such a big deal was that people could watch it live, going on from the Bronco car chase that really kicked off the whole media circus around the OJ trial. Not super relevant. We don't have time to go into OJ and all that stuff. But it's a great example of the evolution of news in the American household. Now, I think a great parallel to what I'm about to talk about is a TikTok feed. Um, I'm guilty of doom scrolling myself. And so what happens is you keep looking for that one video that's going to make all the scrolling worth it, right? And so there's this anticipation. It's kind of like a casino when the lights are flashing. Maybe the next one is going to be the payoff, right? Cable news kind of worked the same way, where they would tease a story, coming up in 30 minutes, we're going to talk about this everyday household item that has the potential to destroy your house in 32 minutes. So they would tease the story, commercial break for zoo books because it's the 90s. Tease the story some more. The casino lights flashing. There's a commercial for Apple Jacks because it's the 90s. Tease the story some more. Commercial for Beyblades because it's the 90s. Tease the story some more. Honestly, kind of a banger Mentos commercial, if I'm being honest. They're worth looking up, but it's the 90s. Tease the story some more. There's the What's Up commercial from, I think, Budweiser. And then they finally tell you what it is after all these different commercial breaks. And this is different than how the news worked just a few decades earlier, where I believe it was Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley would have debates that were limited to just a few hours long, which people thought like, well, how are you going to get anything resolved in a few hours? But another part of cable news is sort of a jangling keys method where you try to keep people as interested in small distractions too. So think of it like the flashing casino lights as opposed to the potential jackpot. So instead of long debates, they would have, or they still do have, these really fast, overcrowded panel debates where people really only get time to say a couple things and not really make any nuanced points. So I believe the Gen Z term for this is clip farming, or trying to have just something that can be clipped for later that's going to be a discussion point in the actual wider discussion, we would say. And I don't know who really started this term, but people started referring to TVs as idiot boxes. Really old people. So I don't know if it was Silent Generation or baby boomers, but you'll hear people calling a TV an idiot box in the 90s and 2000s, which is kind of funny now because they're not even boxes anymore. And it's designed to feel that way, continuing the casino metaphor, is you get the stimulus, dopamine release, so these jangling keys and the short form stuff, desire for more coming from baiting for that, what a household item can kill you in the next 30 minutes will tell you in 27 minutes. And then it, becomes a habit. No, in defense of being dumb, which is a weird thing for someone teaching a college class to say, uh, there is not enough new agencies at the time, and there's too much time to cover, and not everyone wants to hear about the horrible things going on all the time. And so you have this boom in what we'd call less than news, I guess we would say. or instead of calling it quote unquote less than news, we could call it like junk food news. So celebrity news. I don't even know who's in celebrity news anymore. I guess it's how out of touch I am. But back in the day, it was Britney Spears, Lindsay Lohan, just constantly. Who was getting messed up plastic surgery, stuff like that. And on the other hand, you have Weekly World News and National Enquirer just making obvious fake news stories. But it was so fake that no one really cares. And it's more of a, honestly, I don't even know who the market for that is. Well, how does this affect U.S. foreign policy? Is this whole there's not many different news services to choose from, but you have more debate, but most people are still focused on the same set of issues. So everyone's watching, or at least is aware of all the different things going on in debate, and people are still able to relate to each other a lot more. And for the really big events that were happening, everyone would watch them live and have their opinions based on that, and they could relate to each other around the water coolers too. So it didn't really matter what channel you watched. So the same way older generations can talk about where they were when they found out JFK was shot or Pearl Harbor was bombed, um, people can tell you what it was like to watch different 90s events live, and they'll tell you where they were, but it's normally they were watching it on TV. So there's like the OJ car chase, the siege at Waco, Texas, Princess Diana's funeral, and the LA riots. Everyone could tell you where they were when this was going on. So all in all, for as much as all the negatives I talk about cable news, it is more democratized than just Walter Cronkite. It's more like a menu. You get to choose what news stories you want to focus on, which are the most interesting. And if you really don't care about these experimental homeless relief initiatives in a city, you can switch over to the next channel and figure something else out. So people are able to pursue their interests more. Now, news services know that people are going to switch over the channel if they don't like what they're watching. So what they decide to do is specialize in becoming generally far left or more to the left or more to the right or far right. And they start specializing in this. So Fox News becomes right wing. Fox News was kind of always right wing, but that's a different story. It was founded to be right wing, is my point. CNN, MSNBC tend to drift left, especially in recent, I'd say over the last 10 years. I didn't make this chart, by the way. I just found it on Facebook. So I don't watch any of these shows, so I can't tell you how far right or far left any of this is. One thing that this can affect is what they choose to spend their investigative journalism resources on. So investigative journalism is in-depth original reporting, normally challenges a powerful institution, and it normally takes a very long time to get the level of detail and big claims going into it. I think when people think of investigative journalism's intersection with politics, the first story that comes to mind is the Watergate scandal. Literally brought down the Nixon administration. Aside from that, you have the Pentagon Papers or journalists finding out that the government knew it was lying about the reasons to invade Vietnam. There's the My Lai massacre, also related to Vietnam. That was this guy here. His name is Hugh Thompson. He's a helicopter pilot who helped expose war crimes going on in Vietnam in a village called My Lai, where a infantry captain, Ernest Medina, was slaughtering civilians. And it was covered up until it came out through investigative reporting. And then the Iran-Contra scandal, which we have talked about. Investigative journalism really doesn't make its money back on the first article that comes out, but all the subsequent articles. So all the human resources that went into investigating the Watergate scandal or the Iran-Contra and stuff like that aren't going to be worth it until they do follow-up stories, and then over time the follow-up stories is what makes it all worth it. Now, the opposite of investigative reporting is access journalism, gatekeeping. You can almost think of it as PR for politicians, and that's politicians don't have unlimited time to talk to journalists. They don't have unlimited time, period. But they're incentivized to talk to a few, so they have to be strategic about who they talk to. And they will normally pick interviews they know will be friendly or at least not that hostile. Now, the flip side to that is if you're a journalist and you want to maintain access to a politician, you kind of have to do some work as their PR man or woman. And it really does come across as PR sometimes. Now, both sides do this. I didn't know who is it Nelk boys? I feel like I'm gonna get in trouble for saying that. It feels like a dirty word. The Nelk boys met with Trump. Uh, Before break, we talked about Cardi B meeting with Joe Biden. I don't think Nicki Minaj has interviewed Trump, though. So we'll leave her out of this for now. Who interviewed JD Vance, though, was Joe Rogan. And then I am not in the demo for this, but Alex Cooper, I believe her name is, interviewed Kamala Harris on Call Her Daddy. But these aren't meant to be hard-hitting interviews. They're meant to be PR more than anything. And then sometimes you actually do see more neutral interviews. This is the internet news show Breaking Points. Ted Cruz went on to promote a book he was selling. What's interesting about this, though, is the guy on the left is literally on the left, Ryan Grim. He's, I would say, very left-wing. And then the lady on the right, Emily Chachinsky, is, believe it or not, right-wing. But you have a left-wing and a right-wing person interviewing a guy at the same time, and it makes for an interesting conversation. And it's not to say access journalism never pays off. What's normally you get very interesting news stories happening is when a politician is expecting a very friendly interview and then it turns hostile or then it turns challenging and not seriously hostile. They're not accusing or fighting or anything, but a hostile interview is one where the person being interviewed is challenged a bit. Sometime last year, I believe it was, Tucker Carlson, who sort of had a reputation for being, or still does have a reputation for being very right wing, gave a very challenging interview to Ted Cruz, Kamala Harris, and Lester Holt. After that interview, Kamala Harris did not give an interview for at least over a year. It went so poorly for her. Chris Wallace and Donald Trump at the bottom left. And then Joe Biden and George Stephanopoulos on the bottom right. And additionally, you have cases where the media just decides to not talk about something. This is more popular when there was less democracy within the media, there's fewer options. So it's very easy to just kill a story if a few core news organizations aren't going to run it. And so what that looks like a lot of the time is just not even a conspiracy, but everyone having the same interest and deciding not to talk about something. And what that's called is gatekeeping. And it occurs with stories and it occurs with undesirable reporters not being able to talk. And that ultimately has a story just going nowhere. One of the main reasons for this, especially back in the day, was access journalism, or trying to keep access to politicians by not upsetting them too much. So we saw that with the Jewish refugees coming to the United States to escape Nazi Germany in the 30s, only to be sent back to Nazi Germany because the United States didn't want to risk antagonizing Hitler. They thought they could still work with him. So literally sending people to a state that hates them, it's not a good look, but news didn't really report on it that much. Or if you look at the old videos, they report it as a good thing. Helping these people get back home, I think, was the tone it has, which is not the case. On top of that, you also have a lot of the media and the book about the AIDS crisis called And the Band Played On, blaming this Canadian flight attendant, Gaetan Dugas, that's over 8 years of French lessons there, blaming him for the AIDS outbreak, and on a wider scale, blaming the gay community that was being stereotyped as promiscuous for the AIDS epidemic, when he wasn't really patient 0 in his medical records. He was O for outside of California. So instead of a 0, it was an O in his medical record for out of California. News didn't really report on that because it made sense, or it helps people scapegoat the gay community for the AIDS crisis. But what it also, I don't think, would have been able to, because the nuance that went into how the AIDS outbreak happened is just not something that 1980s news, I think, was capable of communicating. This is just a personal opinion, though. Some more egregious cases, JFK and his health concerns and his alleged many affairs. Why would they not want to report on this? Well, because JFK was a super popular president until, Dallas. But going from that, though, it also made sense not to antagonize the federal government, or they could try to come back on you. And that's more or less the reason why the media knew FDR was in a wheelchair but never really reported on it. It looking back now, it's pretty offensive to think that just because a person is in a wheelchair would mean they were weak. But this whole idea of promoting him as someone who can walk and is therefore strong, it sounds ridiculous to say out loud, but I think we all get what I'm getting at, is that they were covering it up because they wanted to maintain access. And you're probably thinking now, like, well, the media covering up a health concern, that would never happen now. And in a sense, you're right, because the media was reporting on Joe Biden's cognitive issues years before that disastrous debate. And there's currently speculation about Trump possibly having health issues. Frankly, with his just looking at average age of a white American male compared to their ages, and it would be weird if they had 0 health concerns. So, just food for thought. So to review, with pre-internet media, we have agenda setting, or the media really trying to drive the conversation and what topics are talked about and what topics are ignored. There's the framing effects, or this idea that the media is going to give you an either-or decision. Do you want to give up all your privacy or have terrorists roaming the streets? It's either or. Not really, of course. 24-hour news and rapid response. Investigative journalism, just sort of the opposite of 24-hour news. And then gatekeeping, or just keeping the right people in the room to talk about the issues in this sort of mutual bond of trust between the reporters and the people that they're reporting on. Now, all that's going to change once the internet hits the news, but we'll talk about that Thursday. Now, as always, if you have any questions or comments, shoot me an email. It's about the lesson or about grading or anything like that. If you're bored, shoot me an email, send me a funny joke. And we will be back. Well, I'll have another lesson uploaded for y'all on Thursday. All right, see ya.